We have always been shown the 19th century in pastel tones, an era of gallant cavaliers, rustling crinolines, early locomotives, and the triumph of romantic literature. Open any school textbook, you will be told about the Industrial Revolution, the abolition of serfdom, and the invention of the telegraph. Everything looks logical, sequential, and, most importantly, safe. But just setting aside the approved methodology for a moment and looking at the dry statistics, this glossy picture begins to crack. Behind the facade of balls and literary salons lies a completely different reality, which academic science prefers to remain silent about, shamefully averting its gaze. If we remove the romantic veneer and look at the map of the world in the mid-19th century through the eyes of a military analyst, we are seized by horror. This was not an era of progress. It was a century of total, unceasing slaughter, the scale of which is unimaginable to a normal person. We are led to believe that the planet was shaken by disparate local conflicts. Allegedly, Great Britain was expanding its colonies somewhere out there. The United States was dealing with internal problems, and China was suffering from trade disputes. But this version crumbles to dust once we compare the dates. Have you ever tried to place all these events on a single timeline? Do this, and a frightening picture of absolute synchronicity opens up before you. The world was not merely feverish. It burned in a unified flame, as if at the command of an invisible conductor. The entire globe was engulfed in hostilities in one incredibly compressed decade. Recall the year 1848. Europe erupts in a series of revolutions known as the Springtime of Nations. Social explosions occur in Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and Budapest almost simultaneously. No sooner does the smoke clear from European streets than in 1850, literally the next day in historical terms, on the other side of the world in China, the so-called Taiping Rebellion begins. Historians call it a civil war, but the scale of the losses raises doubts about the adequacy of this term. Just 3 years later, in 1853, the Crimean War breaks out. Leading world powers gather their fleets in one location, the closed Black Sea. A few years later, in 1857, India is shaken by the Sepoy Rebellion. By 1861, a bloody confrontation breaks out between the North and the South in the United States. This chain of disasters is capped off by the Paraguayan War, which began in 1864 and led to the almost total disappearance of the population of an entire country. Don't you find it strange that the planet erupted everywhere at once? Official science asks us to believe in a random coincidence. Each fire has its unique cause. Somewhere it's the economy, somewhere it's religion, and somewhere it's the struggle for rights. But from a basic logical standpoint, such a density of events cannot be a coincidence. When a fire starts simultaneously in the living room, the attic, and the basement, no sane person would say it is merely the coincidence of faulty wiring. It is evident that the building is being set ablaze, and it's being done systematically, according to a pre-approved plan. In the mid-19th century, our common home was being deliberately set on fire, and the intensity of this process left no chance for salvation. It was a global cleansing of territories. The aggressor in this scheme is quite clearly identifiable. It is a coalition of Western powers forming a new world order. The British Empire and its situational allies, whose interests surprisingly coincided across all continents. But the main question that arises when analyzing this synchronized slaughter concerns not the attackers. Against whom was such power directed? Who was truly being protected, and who was being annihilated with bayonets and grapeshot, from the American prairies to the Great Wall of China. Explanations about peasant uprisings and internal strife cease to work if we assess the resources. United fleets are not assembled to fight disparate rebels or poorly armed aborigines, nor are extermination wars waged for decades against them. It is clear that the opponent possessed strength, organization, and technologies that posed a real threat to the advancing New World. The answer to the question of whom exactly this total war was waged against lies in the nature of the destruction. The traces, which cannot be hidden even a century and a half later, scream at us of the use of weapons of unimaginable power. The most horrifying, dark, and bloody chapter of this global operation was the event known as the Taiping Rebellion in China. Academic historians dryly present casualty figures, from 20 to 30 million. But independent estimates raise the bar to a monstrous total of 100 million human lives. Consider this scale: 100 million. This is more than the population of most modern states. And all this happened in the mid-19th century, when, according to the official version, the main weapons were muskets and sabers. We are asked to believe that such a demographic catastrophe was the result of a civil war unleashed by religious fanatics and peasants. But let us apply common sense and knowledge of military affairs. Peasant armies armed with hoes and primitive weapons are physically incapable of exterminating such a number of people in such a short time. For genocide on such a scale, industrial machine extermination is necessary. There needs to be refined logistics, uninterrupted supplies of ammunition, and artillery of colossal power. Where would simple rebels acquire such resources? If we turn to the surviving engravings and rare photographs of Chinese cities from that period, we do not see traces of fires or street battles. We see ruins that frighteningly resemble the aftermath of carpet bombings of the 20th century. Stone buildings are not just damaged, they are turned to dust. Quarters are transformed into fine gravel. There is a well-founded version that China at that time was not a backward agrarian territory, but one of the last strongholds of an ancient, highly developed civilization. That very Great Asia, or Tartaria, which was so diligently erased from maps. Under the guise of suppressing a rebellion, Western powers, in alliance with the Manchu dynasty, methodically destroyed the indigenous population that possessed knowledge and technologies dangerous to the new masters of the world. This was a cover operation, where amid the noise of civil turmoil, there was a total cleansing of the territory and erasure of historical memory. Let's move to the other side of the world, to North America. Here we discover a strikingly similar picture of destruction, which is explained to us as the Civil War between the North and South. From childhood, we have been led to believe that this was a noble conflict for the liberation of slaves and preservation of national unity. But documentary evidence tells a different story. Look at the photographs of the destroyed cities of the South: Richmond, Atlanta, Charleston. The photographs show brick shells without roofs, neighborhoods burned to the ground, the skeletons of majestic buildings sticking up, and a complete absence of ceilings. The nature of these destructions raises many questions for any engineer or fortification specialist. Field artillery of the mid-19th century fired iron cannonballs. Yes, a cannonball can punch a hole in a wall. It can destroy part of a parapet, but it does not possess the kinetic energy capable of leveling city blocks down to the foundation, turning them into dust. What we see in American cities in the 1860s remarkably resembles the landscapes of Dresden or Hiroshima after aerial bombings in 1945. there is a persistent feeling that the Northern Army was not restoring constitutional order, but rather conducting a total cleansing of territories. These lands housed wealthy city-states that were part of the global system of the Old World. The architecture of the South was ancient, grandiose. Colonnades, domes, granite embankments, all this could not have been built by the colonists who arrived in wagons to the wild lands just a couple of decades before the war. These cities needed to be destroyed to erase the memory of those who actually built them, and the population replaced. The statistics of losses in this war also raise bewilderment. Official figures are constantly adjusted upwards, but demographic gaps indicate the disappearance of far more people than is commonly believed. The asymmetry of these wars lay not in tactics, but in the overwhelming technological superiority of one side. We see traces of the use of weapons whose power far exceeds everything that officially existed in the arsenals of that time. Someone had the capability to turn stone into dust and demolish entire metropolises, while the other side could only unsuccessfully defend itself. But to fully understand the nature of this destructive impact and approach the mystery of the technologies used, it is necessary to pay attention to the objects that the aggressors attempted to destroy with particular maniacal persistence, but could not erase entirely. Traces of this struggle lead us to the bastions of Sevastopol and deep into the South American continent. The Crimean War, which official history presents as a conflict between Russia and a coalition of Britain, France, and Turkey for control over the Straits, upon closer inspection, transforms into one of the most mysterious operations of the 19th century. If we discard the political rhetoric of that time and look at the map of military operations, a logical question arises. Why would the greatest powers of the world send their enormous fleets into a closed, essentially internal sea? Why spend colossal resources and lay siege for years to a single city, Sevastopol? From a purely military standpoint, such concentration of forces and means for one point on the map seems absurd, unless, of course, the true objective differed from the declared one. Sevastopol was not just a strategic port. Its bastions were cyclopean structures literally cut into the rocky terrain. An extensive network of underground communications, the most complex engineering infrastructure, the use of polygonal masonry. The claim that such fortifications were built with pickaxes and shovels by soldiers and sailors under continuous enemy fire does not withstand any criticism. The volume of earth and rock work necessary to create such a system is comparable to the construction of a modern subway. This cannot be accomplished in a short time under siege conditions. It is more logical to assume that Sevastopol, like many other so-called star forts around the world, was the object of ancient infrastructure. It was an energy hub, a logistics center, or a technical complex of a previous civilization. The new masters of the world sought not to capture it, but rather to destroy it. The coalition was erasing the city from the face of the earth with maniacal persistence, turning antiquity into rubble. The task was simple. The functionality of this object must never be restored. Gazing into the description of the invading army, one can notice a strange unification. The French, British, Sardinians, yesterday's geopolitical rivals, act as a single mechanism. They seem to be dressed from the same warehouse and receive orders from a single center. This resembles a global police operation, where the united army of the New World Order conducts a cleansing. There is the impression of a sort of staged match in which two huge forces destroy an ancient city, while simultaneously disposing of the excess male population of their countries in senseless frontal assaults. An even more tragic and illustrative example of cleansing is found in South America. The Paraguayan War represents an unprecedented act of genocide. Small Paraguay stood against giants, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. The outcome of this conflict is monstrous, even by the standards of the most brutal wars. Up to 90% of the male population of the country perished. Reflect on that figure. 9 out of 10 men were physically annihilated. Such statistics indicate that the goal was not to defeat an army or change a government. The goal was the total physical liquidation of the carriers of a certain cultural and genetic code. Historians acknowledge that Paraguay before the war was a unique state. Self-sufficient, with developed industry, railways, and telegraph built without British loan bondage. It was a country system falling out of control of the emerging global financial web. There is a high probability that Paraguay was a kind of refuge, an enclave. There, deep in the continent, remnants of a previous civilization tried to survive and preserve their technologies. A coalition of neighbors, generously armed and funded from abroad, played the role of the executioner. They destroyed the men who remembered the true history, possessed technical skills, and had a spirit of independence. Women and children were left to mix blood and create a new, obedient people, stripped of memory. Thus, in both hemispheres, we see the same picture: the destruction of material and human carriers of the old order. However, a serious contradiction arises here, which cannot be resolved within the framework of school physics. The bastions of Sevastopol, the forts of America, and the fortresses of Europe were built of granite and high-quality brick. To turn these structures into the ruins we see in old photographs is not enough for a simple iron cannonball filled with gunpowder. Ordinary artillery leaves dents. It can chip a block, but it cannot melt stone. And here we approach the most inconvenient evidence of that era. The traces of thermal effects of such a force that do not fit into official representations of the technologies of the 19th century. The skepticism of official science faces an insurmountable obstacle when it comes to material evidence of the destruction of the mid-19th century. Let us set aside chronicles that may have been rewritten to please the victors. Let us turn to physics and materials science. A picture opens before us that is absolutely incompatible with the level of technology attributed to that era. While exploring the ruins of fortifications, such as Fort Sumter and Fort Pulaski in the U.S., fortifications near Paris, or the forts of Kronstadt, independent researchers discover a phenomenon that cannot be explained by the impact of standard artillery. It concerns vitrification. This is the process of turning stone and brick into a glass-like mass under the influence of extreme temperatures. We observe granite blocks that flowed like wax and set in bizarre flows. We see brickwork that has turned into a single, glassy monolith, where individual bricks melted together at the molecular level. The physics here is relentless. The melting point of granite is about 1,200 degrees Celsius. For quality brick, this threshold may be even higher. An explosion of gunpowder, even in large quantities, creates a shockwave and fragmentary damage. It generates a brief flash, but does not produce a sustainable heat field of such intensity and duration to melt multi-meter walls into a liquid state. This means only one thing. In the so-called wars of the mid-19th century, weapons of a fundamentally different class were used. The nature of the damage directly indicates the use of powerful thermal or possibly plasma impacts. The principle of operation of this weapon is either unknown to modern society or deliberately classified. This hypothesis finds confirmation when analyzing the famous Great Fires that swept the world during the same era. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Spokane, and in Eurasia, Moscow and Kiev. All these cities burned according to the same strange scenario. Official versions attribute the destruction of huge metropolises to domestic absurdities. A tipped kerosene lamp, a spark in a haystack, or careless smoking. This sounds like mockery of common sense. Simple sparks do not consume hectares of capital stone construction. The fire spread at an unnatural speed, often against the wind, leaving residents no chance for evacuation. But most importantly, it is the consequences. In these fires, steel melted and flowed into storm drains like water. Stone and brick crumbled into sand, losing their crystalline structure. This occurs not during ordinary wood burning, but under the influence of extreme temperatures characteristic of the use of high-grade incendiary mixtures or directed beam weapons. It was a targeted operation to clear architectural heritage. Cities did not just burn. They were destroyed to the ground to make way, to free up space for primitive boxes made of red brick, which we today mistakenly consider historical buildings. The asymmetry of this war lay in the fact that the attacking side, representing the interests of the emerging new order, likely had access to atmospheric or even orbital strike technologies. The defenders, the inhabitants of the old city-states, were defenseless. Perhaps their defensive systems, the very domes or energy fields that legends vaguely mention, were preemptively disabled as a result of some global failure or sabotage. People found themselves trapped. Their homes were incinerated by directed impulses, turning stone into lava and organic matter into dust. Later, historians would call these events warehouse fires or accidental ignitions, concealing the fact of the use of weapons of mass destruction. However, even if we accept the version of high-tech warfare from the air, the question of ground operations remains open. After all, it is not enough to just burn the territory. It needs to be occupied, held, and controlled. And here, official history falls into its own logistical trap. How could the million-strong armies, of which we are told in school, mobilize, supply, and conduct active combat operations over gigantic distances in the complete absence of roads? How was logistics ensured if the infrastructure was supposedly destroyed or not yet built? The answer to this question forces us to reconsider not only the history of wars, but also the chronology of natural disasters. After analyzing destructive conflicts and unexplained technological anomalies, we encounter yet another frightening contradiction. This time, demographic. Mathematics is an exact science, and it ruthlessly dismantles the official picture of world recovery in the second half of the 19th century. If we are to believe historical reports, during global conflicts, epidemics, and alleged natural catastrophes, a significant part of the male population of the planet perished. In some regions, as we found in the case of Paraguay, losses reached up to 90%. The biological laws of reproduction are immutable. The human population cannot recover instantaneously. A woman cannot give birth to 5 children a year, and a child needs at least 15 to 20 years to grow up and become productive. However, statistics show an explosive, avalanche-like increase in population almost immediately after the end of the Great Slaughter. The population not only recovered, it doubled and tripled in just a few decades. From a biological standpoint, this is absolutely impossible. There are no natural mechanisms for such a leap. The only rational explanation for this phenomenon lies in a realm that even the boldest researchers are afraid to discuss. It concerns the mass artificial filling of territories with new people. It was precisely in the middle of the 19th century that thousands of large orphanages and homes sprang up around the world as if on command. The term "children of the regiment" emerged. In the United States, entire orphan trains began circulating, transporting homeless children by the thousands to deserted towns and farms in the Midwest. Where did millions of parentless children come from overnight? Their origins are murky, documents are often missing or grossly forged. These children, stripped of ancestral memory and connection to the past, were drilled in conditions of strict discipline. They were given new, often standardized surnames, Smith, Johnson, Miller, and prepared for the role of ideal performers. Workers for factories and soldiers for new armies. They did not know their roots. They had no grandparents who could tell the truth about what had happened to the world. There exists a terrifying theory, supported by strange exhibits from those years, that this process was not natural. At the world exhibitions of the late 19th century, incubators for infants were openly demonstrated to the public. We are told that these were merely medical devices for caring for premature babies, but the scale and context of their use suggest technologies for artificial growing or cloning. Perhaps this was how the problem of depopulation was solved. The new masters of the world created the service human, a biorobot biologically identical to previous humans, but with a clean hard drive instead of the memory of ancestors. Alongside the physical filling of the void, there was a reformatting of consciousness. Entire ethnic groups emerged that had not existed on maps before. In the offices of linguists, literary languages were created and implemented, dialects were standardized, and new grammatical norms were introduced. A single proto-language, on which the world may have communicated before the catastrophe, was deliberately fragmented into dozens of artificial dialects. This was done to implement the principle of divide and rule. People, not remembering their kinship, were artificially made strangers to one another, creating barriers of misunderstanding and laying the groundwork for future conflicts. We, who live today, are highly likely to be descendants of this very generation. Those who were populated in cleansed cities or grown to service the new system. We were not just conquered, we were replaced. But this new population, despite the erased memory, still had eyes. They saw majestic ruins, star fortresses, and incredible architecture that their primitive ancestors, colonists with hammers and saws, could not have built. A cognitive dissonance arose. To ensure that the new people did not ask extra questions capable of destroying the fragile structure of lies, it was necessary to execute the most grandiose hoax in human history. It was necessary to completely rewrite reality and substitute the past. To solidify the success of the physical replacement of the population and finally establish the new order, the occupying administration staged a grand spectacle. It was meant to legitimize the stolen heritage and erase the memory of its true creators. The central act of this production were the so-called World Exhibitions of the late 19th century, held in Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, and other major centers. Official history tries to convince us that these incredible architectural complexes were temporary decorations. We are told about palaces, towers, artificial canals, fountains, and complex electrical lighting. And all of this was allegedly constructed from plaster, tow, and wood in just one season, purely for the amusement of the public. We are asked to believe that colossal resources, human, financial, material, were spent on creating disposable decorations. Moreover, these decorations, in terms of engineering complexity and aesthetic perfection, surpassed everything that the modern construction industry can build, even with the use of concrete and cranes. However, the lack of photographs of the phased construction of these giants raises certain thoughts. The monumentality of the structures, their elaboration, and the presence of complex communications all scream that the world exhibitions were a cynical operation of appropriation. The new masters of the world simply found surviving, preserved urban complexes of the old civilization. They carried out cosmetic repairs, cleaned the facades, activated the remaining infrastructure, and opened them to the public as their own achievements. Visitors, those new people without ancestral memory, were shown the remnants of former greatness, passed off as a triumph of the industrial progress of the current era. "Look," they said, "what we've achieved with our steam engines." And immediately after the exhibitions closed, these architectural masterpieces were ruthlessly destroyed. They were blown up, burned, or dismantled for building materials. Why? The answer is obvious. It was the destruction of evidence. People were shown a paradise in which they could live, and then it was wiped off the face of the earth. We were conditioned to believe that beauty is ephemeral, that it cannot be preserved, that the norm of existence is gray concrete boxes and barracks, while antique grandeur is just a fairy tale, an unattainable ideal. An even more sinister element of these exhibitions was the human zoos. Representatives of supposedly wild tribes brought from the colonies were kept in enclosures. But if one looks closely at documentary evidence, many of these savages, dressed in rags, had noble European facial features. They carried themselves with a dignity that was not characteristic of primitive peoples. There is a version that these were surviving representatives of the old elite. Captured, stripped of everything, they were put on display as a mockery. It was an act of psychological suppression. The crowd was instilled with a simple idea: the past is barbarism and primitivism, and the new power is the only path to light and civilization. We were made to believe in the evolution from monkey to rational man, although in reality, humanity was forcibly lowered to a level close to the animal through the deprivation of divine heritage and high technologies. Alongside the visual deception, there was a total cleansing of the information field. During this period, the world's largest libraries and archives were burning. The fire at the Library of Congress, the destruction of chronicles in China, the demise of European book storage, these are not coincidences. This is systematic data removal, technical documentation, maps of the real world, knowledge about free energy, ether, and atmospheric electricity disappeared into the fire. In its place came the Prussian education system, which was implemented everywhere precisely in the mid-19th century. Barrack-type schools, where children were made to sit still for hours and memorize dogmas, were created not for enlightenment. Their goal was training. To kill the creative impulse, suppress critical thinking, and raise the ideal executor. A person who will never question the discrepancy between what is written in the textbook and what he sees with his own eyes. As a result of this grand operation, we were artificially thrown back in development by thousands of years. The technological breakthroughs that avalanche-like appeared at the end of the 19th century, radio, electricity, cars, are presented to us as the brilliant insights of individuals. We are told tales about Edison, Tesla, or Bell, who supposedly invented all this in their garages. But most likely, these people were not inventors. They were talented archaeologists and adapters. They were allowed to decipher and adapt a small part of the surviving technical documentation from the previous era. The victors appropriated the technologies of the defeated, but they gave us only their degraded, commercially viable versions. Instead of pure and infinite energy of the ether, which fed the destroyed star fortresses and cathedrals, humanity was put on the needle of hydrocarbons. We were made to burn coal, oil, and gas. We were given primitive combustion technologies so that we would depend on energy suppliers, so that we would forget that once electricity was as free and ubiquitous as air. We were sold a meter instead of freedom. By piecing together the scattered fragments of this mosaic, we come to an inevitable and frightening conclusion. It completely changes the perception of the surrounding reality. The 19th century was not a springboard of progress, as we have been assured all these years. It became an insurmountable frontier, a wall separating humanity from its true history. We live on the graveyard of a great civilization, not even suspecting it. Our cities are built on foundations, the creation of which we can no longer achieve. We walk the streets under which the floors of buildings have been buried, having gone underground as a result of that very global catastrophe. Everything we have come to consider achievements of the industrial era is actually a result of degradation. We were intentionally thrown back in development. We were deprived of access to pure and boundless sources of energy, replacing them with primitive organic combustion. This allows control over every step and every resource. Those benefits of civilization that we pride ourselves on today, from radio waves to smartphones, are just pitiful crumbs. They are adapted remnants of technologies that we are permitted to use. We are like savages who found a complex device and use it as a mirror or hammer, unaware of its true capabilities. The entire official history, written by the victors, is not a chronicle of real events. It is a cover-up legend, carefully crafted by the occupying administration. Kings, emperors, and presidents of that era appear not as sovereign rulers, but as appointed managers. Their task was to legalize the redistribution of property and ensure the uninterrupted functioning of the new exploitation system. Revolutions and social upheavals were just tools of cleansing and redistribution of assets. It was a spectacle to divert attention, while behind the scenes a global paradigm shift was taking place. However, the truth, like grass through asphalt, breaks through the thickness of lies. It screams at us from the facades of ancient buildings whose first floors have sunk deep underground, buried under clay of unknown origin. It can be seen on old maps, where the supposedly wild wastelands of Siberia and America are marked with hundreds of cities of Tartaria and other vanished states. The memory of the past emerges even in old cemeteries. There, the tombstones, until the mid-19th century, are often devoid of the familiar Christian symbolism. They are adorned with urns, inverted torches, or solar signs, testifying that our ancestors adhered to a completely different worldview and perhaps lived much longer than us. The system relies solely on our ignorance and fear of acknowledging the obvious. We have been convinced that we are the pinnacle of creation, the result of prolonged evolution. Meanwhile, facts suggest that we are survivors of a shipwreck. We have lost our memory and landmarks, forgotten who we are and where we come from. We inhabit a setting whose meaning is forgotten, and we use tools whose principles of operation we understand only superficially. Now each of us faces a fundamental choice. We can continue to believe in a cozy but false fairy tale from the school textbook, where the world is clear, linear, and safe. Or we can muster the courage to open our eyes. The realization that history has been rewritten and civilization has been reloaded is the first step. This step is towards reclaiming our true human dignity and possibly restoring lost knowledge. Reality is much more complex and tragic than we have been allowed to know. But only by accepting it in all its fullness do we cease to be obedient screws in someone else's machine and gain a chance at a genuine future. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell to not miss new investigations. Many more mysteries and discoveries lie ahead. We will continue to seek evidence, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what official science ignores. Because the truth is always nearby. You just have to want to see it.